Okay, hello there. So yeah, just Simon Hobbs, and I just wanted to sort of add to what Enzo said is that in that Little Engine does, we like to be sort of a plug-in Drupal shop into agencies that do great service design and sort of are really passionate, and that's what I believe today design, and so Dan is going to start us off from today.
All right, thank you, Sai. So my name is Dan. I am a senior front-end developer, so I like to build really interesting things. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we're meeting today, the Ngunnawal people. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and we pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So this is a talk about a project. This is a project review. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the project, and then we'll go into what we learned about both the back end for Drupal and then the front end and things we learned about Vue and Nuxt along the way. So the context for us as today is important. So today is a strategic design company. So we get involved from first principles. So we work on transformational design for organizations, human-centered service design. So really, who are the people that your organization is trying to serve, and making sure that we're solving the right problem the right way. And as a developer, I get involved when we then take those designs and build beautiful functional products. So who here has ever interacted with an office health and safety body of some type or another? WorkSafe Victoria, or it's a lot of people, and it's relevant to every workplace, which is why we were so excited to get involved with this project. WorkSafe Victoria in particular is in the middle of a transition. So they are looking at 2030 as their next major milestone goal. And what they're trying to achieve is to shift to what they call a prevention model. So they have WorkSafe has a reputation for being the compliance body, for being the regulatory body, for being the people who come through and tick boxes and give you fines. And they really don't see themselves that way, and they're trying to shift how they're perceived to being much more involved as a community partner. How can we help you to create a safe workplace, because we both agree that that's really important. So as a starting point, our brief was that WorkSafe's digital presence was quite fragmented. They had a squiz matrix family of sites. In some cases, it was easier to make an entirely new site than add content to their own website. So one of the problems we were trying to solve is how can we make sure that your digital presence is consistent and scalable. Through our design phase, we use these as the key pillars of who WorkSafe are, and then how the digital product should reflect that. So, right, I was saying they don't want to just be transactions. They want to provide an actually great experience. They don't just want to be about compliance. They want to be involved from the beginning and as a help. So they have a lot of things on the internet. This project in particular, we were rebuilding the main WorkSafe website, but then we were also, as a proof of concept, showing that how they could use the tools that we built for them to continue building out digital products. So the other one that we worked on was called WorkWell, which is a web application to help organizations better support the mental health and well-being of their employees. So we'll get into this a bit more later, but we were using the same Drupal API and the same design language to spin up separate applications. But as a design company, we start with the people. So we had an extensive design research phase where we got out into the field talking with the people who would eventually be the end users of the product. And it's easy to make assumptions about what those needs are, but it's very important for us to validate everything as we're going with prototypes, starting with paper prototypes. Eventually we had a clickable prototype in the design phase that really were key to making sure that we're doing the right thing. We love technology, but we just make sure that it's fit for purpose and that we're not shoehorning in a technical decision because it's interesting.
So to give you a really high level sort of technical overview of what we're talking about today, we're essentially talking about a Drupal 8 based content API. The The interfaces to that Drupal site are 80% covered by the JSON API module and spec, and also custom REST resources, which allow us to talk to Apache Solr. On the other side, we're building out a component library using Vue.js, so something that lives independently of any sort of client application, in a sense, but allows us to demonstrate all of our tools. So it's our pattern library, our style guide. And then in the middle of that, we've got client applications running on the Nuxt framework. Dan will talk a bit more about the Nuxt framework as a front ender, but essentially it's bringing that all together. You notice that the component library, we don't really talk about hosting, it's an NPM module. We've got the DPC hosting the front end applications on the single digital platform, and if I get that name right, and Acquia running the content APIs. So the big question for any sort of government organisation would be, why decouple Drupal? Any organisation really. So the clear benefit that I would point out is when you really want to combine all of your content and centralise all your content into a content API. You get this great advantage of having all of your editors working through one place and all of your content being used once, and they're like written once and used everywhere. And that's one of the goals that we're all aiming for, in a sense, is to how to stop the siloing of our content. It means that you don't have the same limitations on the number of client applications that you're building. You don't have the same, you don't have this problem of creating content silos in random bespoke applications from third-party vendors. You can really say to that third-party vendor who wants to build a mobile app or build a new application for a single-page application, there's the content. It allows for a lot of front-end innovation, I believe. It really unleashes the front-enders, in a sense, to kind of go off and really do some really cool stuff, which I love as a Drupal consultant. I really love that. And I believe it does improve the overall elasticity of your solution, of your architecture over time, being able to pull some things out that you want to improve or don't work very well. Replace Drupal with another content API if you want to. But then the question comes, why not Drupal? Why not decouple Drupal? And if you've got sort of really foundational website, all the content's in there, and you really feel like that's working for you, and you don't really have any need to actually, be pushing that content in other places, then you might have a Drupal vendor who actually works really well on that model. Well, what's the advantage of actually decoupling that? There's probably not a massive advantage to it. The team that you've got suits Drupal. You understand Drupal. You've got themers. Someone's got themers in the whole mix who know how to make Drupal look great. But there's some little things where I truly say you shouldn't decouple Drupal. I think that there's the webform module, for example, does so much. So, trying to redo that in the front end is a bit kind of madness, really. There's so much there. You might also have the ability to do static site generation of your current Drupal site and achieve some of the benefits that you might otherwise get from decoupling. So something like Jekyll, where you're taking a Drupal site and you're creating a static site from that. And then there's the other thing where you can kind of create a schism between front end and back end if you're in certain organisations, in certain cultural contexts, where the front end doesn't understand how the back end works and vice versa, and I don't actually think that that's beneficial. So what we're really looking at in terms of so the other thing the other part of this is we needed to deliver what we called a playbook. So on the left it's a style guide, and it's for anyone who is making a WorkSafe website. So the whole idea is a new vendor comes in, does a great pitch, and then WorkSafe can then give them the playbook and let them then go forward and use what they need to reuse in order to stick to the design and reuse the content. Plus you've got the Storybook for developers. So Storybook is I believe a React application that pulls in Vue components, and basically it describes how developers can reuse the components. And in all those, in the playbook, if you can go to the playbook, it's actually public, and you can go there and you can look at, for example, the custom API endpoints for hitting Solr, which we don't sort of talk that much about today, as well as all the front end design stuff, style guide, like consistency of voice and so forth. So just to summarise that section, Dan talked about design research, high fidelity mock-ups, creating a reusable Vue component library, a reusable headless content API with Drupal, building 2 applications built on that foundation, which is, 2 plus 1, you then step in repeating the same thing. And then the digital playbook for how to do it all again. We won't do sort of a demonstration of the website, which you can do, but you basically, you go to these sites and you can search, it's the usual stuff. All of our listings and things are being driven by content in Solr, which I'll talk a bit more about in the next section. But and we also have things like data set searching and so forth. Okay, so this is my one, the headless Drupal side of things. So when we're talking about headless Drupal, I'm just going to step through the architecture and then bring us talk about modules, talk about custom modules, how much customization we had to do, what worked well, what didn't work well. We had a requirement to host on Acquia. So basically, what does that mean? It means that we have got a stable known product on Acquia. Acquia gives you a big LAMP stack, yeah. We've got a 24-hour help desk, which if we can enable, deliver a product that the Acquia help desk is able to understand, then that's great for WorkSafe because they can use the help desk. But we're also kind of mindful that there's a specific way of building a site on Acquia that looks very different if you're doing something on the new Gov CMS or on like SDP platform or Platform SH. So we wanted to avoid vendor locking. We did want to say, well, what does it look like if someone has to swap something out later? Because the main thing around that is that Solr is essentially decoupled, like it's not running in your LAMP stack on Acquia, but it's not accessible at the edge, and there is costs associated with it, and there's a diagram I'll bring up next. And the final thing is that at the time there was a lot of conversations around, like Dries was doing presentations about Node.js, how awesome decoupled Drupal was, and out of the office of the CTO you got Preston So doing these awesome presentations. But the Node.js service that Acquia provided was very well, was an older version of Node.js, older version of Node. It was a very fixed size. We couldn't add extra routes at the time. And so it just sort of defeated the purpose of it. And I believe that is, that is changing because that's where the industry is going. So just looking at what would an ideal, keep it very simple of course, but what does an ideal decoupled infrastructure look like with Drupals involved? So to me, you've got Drupal running, in our case on a LAMP stack, but you've got Drupal running, PHP, whatever, big box. Editors are going straight to Drupal. None of the applications are going straight to Drupal, in my opinion, because the applications are going through some sort of API gateway, some sort of bus, some sort of consolidation of all of the data and all of the services. And yes, they're getting content from Drupal out of some kind of fast NoSQL source, but they're also getting non-Drupal sources. That doesn't mean if your application is not built like that, it's wrong. That just highlights some of the principles, yeah. So the biggest factor for us was having Solr there. So we needed to go through the LAMP stack, we needed to go through Drupal to get to Solr. So we're mindful that we needed to not be chatty in terms of how we access Solr, because we weren't just installing the search module and then there was a box up in the side. We wanted to take advantage of Varnish and all of the caching and stuff like that on the endpoint. So that the main impact for us was that all of our editor admin access and all of our content API access was all going through the same pipe. And that did have implications on how headers worked through Acquia, in the Acquia network. Sometimes something that comes, like a content API endpoint has a different shape in terms of speed and caching and stuff than an editor working with Drupal. So it wasn't ideal, but we sort of had to detangle those two things. And then we wanted features both of Contenter and of Lightning essentially, because WorkSafe were desired based on demonstrations. They desired the Lightning workflow, right? Whatever that sort of means, it's kind of like they've seen it in principle, and they're all the same modules that we use. But we're like, if we can deliver something that looks like Lightning workflow, that's going to be great. That meets the brief. But on the other side, we're also looking at what's the best practice in terms of headless, and how do we bring those two things together. So we ended up doing custom composer, essentially, that brought in some meta packages from Lightning and meta packages and modules from Contenta. And really reusing those patterns, and that felt pretty good. And we want to take advantage of, when I talked about the Acquia helpdesk, we want something that's basically Drupal, right? Like, you could put a theme on it. If I looked at it and I said I couldn't put a Drupal theme on this, then I feel like you'd be failing. So you're looking at, getting the redirects and your aliases, and you want your workflow, and you want to use Search API. It's so good at, if later you swap out Solr, you want to be able to use Elastic. So you've got content modeling and paragraphs. You're trying to, it's all changing, but you're trying to do the best practices possible. And your editor experience, you want that to be Drupal. And things like tag-based access control. We've all done it. Like where content is tagged in such a way that if an editor is allowed to edit that content, they can. So calling that vanilla Drupal, right? On top of that, it wasn't really like a big smorgasbord of things on top of that to do, and that's why I kind of like that about Drupal headless. We did go a lot with JSON API. Decoupled router was like critical for resolving redirects and resolving any URL that the front end wanted to resolve to something. That's an awesome module. We had the Acquia related stuff, Purge, Cloudflare. Simple OAuth was great for just a public application. And then a few random things like REST menu items, but there weren't that many in hindsight. And I just want to touch on Search API. We did write custom REST resource plugins that talk to Search API and essentially say to Search API, tell me what's in Solr, run this query for me. So we defined the inputs for that, which you can see in the playbook, and then we use Search API. And that was most of our sort of custom code in a sense, other than some other JSON API stuff. Wrapping up my section, I want to talk about JSON API. So let's talk about the good. We sort of had the options of JSON API and GraphQL, and we didn't really explore GraphQL to a great degree. There was in hindsight, that might have been a better option for us. So talking about JSON API, the good. So it's a fantastic starting point for entity data. So if you want to get a node, you want to get some media, it will give you that content, right? It's straightforward. Entities are all the same architecturally, and if so, there's not really any fundamental difference. So for the front end, accessing those entities is like a repeatable pattern. Like the front end's like, oh, it's a node this time, oh, it's a media. I don't really understand what the difference is, but they seem to have the same fields, right? They say I seem to access them in similar ways. I just have to know the entity type. Standards are obviously really good to follow. JSON API is, well and truly headed for core, and I would assume to replace the REST modules in core, but I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. And there's the JSON API module developer community is awesome. So they helped us out so much in the Drupal Slack. But on the other side, we did have some challenges, mostly around our nested data model. So you've got a node, you've got a paragraph, you've got some media, you've got files. So you've got this sort of nested relationship. You've got terms and stuff in there. So we didn't really have an ability that we found to define a schema for the front end to kind of understand. That kind of simplified it to an outward-facing content model. And that's something that you'll see in the JSON API spec is coming. I don't know how long that would be. And it's something that GraphQL has the notion of. Also, we had problems with includes performance in terms of traversing the content structure. That's something else that's improved in the current JSON API version 2. And then, extending and altering, they didn't really want us to. Everything was marked as internal, and they don't really want you to override things, and I get it. So they were heading for core, and that was all fine. So we did have some challenges, and just to capture that idea of the front end with our content model, we were often dealing, if we were to do it in the vanilla JSON API way, we're often asking front enders to construct these extremely elaborate include statements, just in case certain paragraphs have been related to on some content. So in many cases, there was no content being returned. And so all those entity relationships, they must be defined as includes. And we did have some custom code to handle that. I wouldn't do it that way again. I'd be looking seriously at how you can simplify it, what tools you've got to simplify that. So that sort of wraps up the Drupal side of it. I'm now going to hand over to Dan for the front end.
Thanks, Si. Yeah, so I really liked this project. I learned so many new things. Every new little bit was just like a new tool that I as a developer feel so much stronger after I got to go through this whole process. So I've sorted these into things I would do again and things I would not do again. The first one, I really like the tool set we used. As a front-end developer, Vue and Nuxt got me going really quickly in a really good way. If you're interested in more about this, there's a couple other talks at the conference that are talking about it. There's one, I think it's at 2 p.m. today, Let's Go Nuxt. Throughout this project, we talked a lot with the Victorian government single digital presence project. They were doing a very similar thing, headless Drupal, Vue front end. We traded notes a lot, so they're really good people. And I think they're going into a bit more detail about how Nuxt was integrated. But yeah, I would love to use this again. Another great thing that was really powerful for us was component first design, because starting in the design phase, it was much easier to have a shared language between the designers and the developers about the components that we were building and how those grew out into pages. It is not an uncommon thing of here's the page and then it's on the developer to break it out and decide what's reusable. But because we said at the beginning we want these tools to be reusable, it was important to us that as a design language, the components worked with each other well and made sense together in a variety of constellations. And that was also then really helpful once we were able to just start dropping components into Storybook, and it was easier for developers to pick up and keep using. Theming. So we made a component library which gets imported into, as of now, open to as many Nuxt or Vue applications as you want. But we also knew that not all of those applications would need the WorkSafe bright yellow. So we did set it up so that in your client application, you can set up a SAS file and override variables. And so the way it works is there's a Webpack loader that essentially takes your SAS variables and injects it into every Vue component that gets used in the client application. So you can see the banner component here. By default, it has the WorkSafe yellow, but it was quite easy to just override that. And then the primary color was used throughout the component library, so those changes cascade through. So that worked really well. This one's a bit of an odd one, but we put our design system on the wall. So I'm a developer, I'm a very digital person, but it was genuinely really nice to have a physical artifact that we were able to look at and see, and it started conversations, and it made it much easier to have a shared conversation, because it's, at least for me, it's quite a common situation where the designers look at the sketch file and the developers look at the code and the project managers look at whatever they're told to look at. And having this made it a lot easier to point at and show progress on the components of the component library. It was also, as a developer, a really helpful check on the design scope of the project, because if the designers ever want to change something, they have to print it out and walk over to the wall where a developer can see what they're doing. So that was a really nice conversation starter, we'll call it. So another thing that was a bit weird for me as a front-end developer at the beginning is that Drupal determines the routes of your application. So normally in Nuxt, there's a pages folder and it just generates those as like URLs. But because Drupal keeps track of things like aliases and redirects and all of these things, it didn't make much sense to, and also because there's like 1,000 pages of content, it didn't make much sense to define those by hand in the Vue application. So Drupal takes on that responsibility, and it did just mean that there was several more steps that we had to go through, but it gave us a much more resilient solution for the long run. So this is a basic network graph. So first, the Nuxt application checks that the API is up. The red lines are basically the critical path, like the most important bits. So first it checks that the API is running. Then it asks, there's the translate path module. Is that that's the decoupled router module that Si was talking about. So it turns a URL into an entity ID so that we can then ask the JSON API for the right entity with our giant list of includes. And then at the end, some of our components also relied on other data sources. So for example, related content, we powered with our search, actually. So we gave it this is the page I'm on, give me things similar to this. So all of those also happened, but after the JSON API request has come back with the components of the page. The next level up thing we would have done or would do on the next project is use the subrequests module in Drupal, so I can pass a chain of things that I need to ask for without having to have several round trips to Drupal. So I can say, first check that the API is up, then once you've done that, here's the URL, then once you've done that, use that entity ID to structure our request. And so I can just ask Drupal once and it gives me the whole thing back. So, some things we would not do again. We had a really big JavaScript bundle. It's tricky though, because especially because the routing was handled on the Drupal side, a lot of the code splitting techniques and things like that front-enders are normally used to using to minimize the JavaScript that you need on each page, weren't useful, because if the Vue application doesn't know what exists at a route, you can't know what components you need at that route until you've gotten the page back from Drupal with a list of components. So you have to, the first time a person loads the page, you get the entire component library. So what I would do on the next project is really look into lazy loading components as needed, and possibly statically generating at least a subset of pages. Like I said, there's 1,000 pages. So we weren't really looking into a whole statically generated site, but it would have been nice to at least for the key pages, minimize the page load on those. So we made a component library for Vue apps. And so Vue apps have scoping, so you can write your CSS and you can just write minimal CSS and it makes sure that those styles only get applied to that component. But where this bit us in a couple of places. So what I wished we would have done was make sure to still rigorously use our BEM classes. So for anyone who's not familiar, it's just a way of specifying things in components in CSS. We want this component library to be a thing that WorkSafe can use for any project. So for example, actually right now they're working on integrating some Salesforce workflows. And so Salesforce has its whole own thing, but it makes it harder for them to use the same design language since they're not in a Vue app. So for some of the components, we went through that process and made sure they were all BEM and we generated a CSS file, but we didn't do that from the beginning, and I wish we had. That also bit us in the very specific case of, so we had our card component, right? We built it from the beginning to be a link, just a link to another piece of content on the site. Which worked great until that Workwell application, the other app, needed to use the same card component to open a modal window, which for the visual people, you're just looking at it, well, it's the card, you just reuse the card, but in Vue, all those styles were scoped to that very specific component that clicks on a link, and so we had to have another component with the same styles, and yeah, I would have used BEM. Or if you're in React land, styled components is a tool that can help you reuse some of those visual styles separate from the actual JavaScript component. This is an agile project. So lots of things were just happening as they happened, as soon as they could happen. And one of those things was the JSON API got set up and the Vue app got set up, and we just started pulling in data, and then because those requests were quite big, it was just easier for me as a front-end developer to just pass those giant objects from Drupal down through the component tree. But I think it would have been safer because it's more testable if you have a clearly defined interface layer between those two. It also just feels a bit nicer that you don't have to you're not forced to use the field names that Drupal uses because they don't map well to front-end JavaScript applications. That's actually something that SDP project I felt worked out really well, so go check them out. Don't just grab the first tool that works. I think this also comes a bit from Agile, where we just needed to do a thing, so we grabbed the thing that worked. So we started the project with a starter kit that was set up to use Nuxt and had a connection to the Contenta CMS powered by Waterwheel, which was an Acquia library for talking to JSON API. It was just one of those things where hindsight is 20/20, but I kept finding things I wished we'd done instead of that, like tool by tool throughout most of the project. JSON API seems good, but it just felt wrong for our use case. Like as a front-end developer, I had like specific fields I needed and lots of things I didn't need. And a lot of times there were things that I felt should be trivial that were actually, as I was saying, it was very difficult to alter. So we had to go a whole separate custom code route, or I need a page. Okay, well also I need these 50 subfields also to be included. And each one of those subfields has all of the metadata. When really I just need the URL, just make it easy for me. That was where that GraphQL conversation came in, and I think in hindsight I would have preferred something like that, where I on the front end can just say, I need data that looks like this, figure it out. And now there are tools to do that. Last thing, coming back to that component library on the wall, this is actually like a project management thing that we ran into that I've found interesting, that once we made the shared conversation around the components, it sometimes became tricky to say that, well, the component is done, but it's not in the application yet. Like we finished the styles, but it's not, the functionality is not all there. We're like waiting on the API, or we just haven't hooked up this little bit. But there was like an expectation that like once you've put the green check mark on the wall, like the whole thing is done and we can reuse it everywhere. So I don't know exactly what the solution is for that, but it's just something I ran into that I felt was pretty interesting. So bringing it to a close, all of these links are on my Twitter or here, if that interests you. Would encourage you to check it out, and I'd love to talk to people about the playbook in particular. I found it to be a really interesting part of the project because it was finally, documentation was a key deliverable, so you couldn't skip it, which was awesome. Highly encouraged. If we are today strategic design, we like to do lots of these things. If you need support on these things, we'd love to talk to you. If you like doing these things, we are hiring. Would love to talk to you. And thank you very much for your time. We have time for some questions. Yeah, so we have time for some questions if there is any. And we have a microphone.
Any questions?
I'm getting out of this free. Yes. Yeah, typical.
I was just wondering, did you ever consider just, like, you said all the data was going in Solr, did you ever consider just querying Solr directly instead of going through that step?
Yeah, the architecture of Acquia meant we couldn't. So my philosophy there was, how can I get to Solr as fast as possible without bootstrapping as much as possible of Drupal? So we ended up so there was custom REST endpoints. We defined a custom interface to those that made sense to the developers, like what they wanted to query. And whenever we wanted, and so then having Search API let us put sort of properties of that content, like if we needed a hero URL indexed in Solr, we could do that. And then all that would, and then essentially we just run a Search API query from our custom PHP. So if we needed to move that away later and run Solr separately, it'd be, you'd move it into a, like a Symfony app or something like that. You'd probably potentially lose, I'm not sure if you can run the Drupal Search API classes outside of Drupal, but the idea is that, the underlying part of that, you'd use one of the libraries that's available to search against Solr, and then you'd have that solution. So that was a bit of like trying to do something that wasn't regrettable later.
So my question's around deployment. So a lot of this stuff is also like splitting up into two teams, working almost separately, talking about the API. What did the deployment story look like? Was it maybe like a monolithic repo with both sides in there deployed at the same time, or did you see a lot of benefit in being able to roll out front end?
So timing, for sure. and I'll get Dan to talk about the front end side of it, but essentially I knew that I couldn't create a drastic difference in the content modeling. So we treated content modeling like as a sacred cow. So everything that would come through, and like I was constantly telling the front enders, you can't ask for that. It changes things, getting it into that, trying to get that right so that we didn't have to change it. We didn't go live and then, we need to restructure our content model. Because that would be the biggest implication, was the content model, right? So pretty much being aware that we didn't really have the best solution, and that we tried to compensate for that by being as super careful as possible. But then talking about the back end, I'll let front end talk.
Yeah, it was a similar story. It was just about timing and being and having good communication about it. There was a couple of times where like a field name changed and there was some surprises, and having a bit more automated testing I think would have helped. The one interesting thing on the front end we did do is we had this component library as an NPM package, but we actually ended up moving it into a mono repo with the client application because of that. Well, you have to deploy the component library and then you have to deploy the front end application after ticking it up by one version number, and that just became a whole thing. Like component library is great once it's stable, but when you're trying to work on the client and the component library at the same time, it just was challenging.
Great preso. Just a quick question. In a headless environment, how do you go about assuring that content is created correctly, given that all the preview is through the front end?
Something we would have liked to have done more of is create a much better preview environment. We actually created a very simple Drupal theme that emulated what the front end looked like to give, and it was just a CSS file that made it so that the authors really felt like what they were getting was what they were going to get. So essentially that was where I left off on the project was, ideally, well, what would that look like? So the two critical things would have been, firstly, do you have to rework everything in Drupal in order to create that same environment? Or secondly, can you, but I think I probably would have preferred to do something like allow someone to have some sort of authenticated OAuth session in the front end application, and so that when they clicked on the link to look in the front end, it was essentially they're authenticated, and they would then get content that was unpublished, for example, showing through to the endpoint. So I think technically that was quite possible, and we didn't have a sprint where we were able to explore it further.
What we actually did on another project was we made a single page app of the front end application and showed that in the preview pane. So it was not server-side rendered, but it was still just a JavaScript application that like requested the API endpoints and spun it up right there in Drupal before it was published. Or in that case, it was a Silver Stripe website, but same principle, like replace the preview with the JavaScript app.
I would just capture on that as well. I do think that the component model, well, we had heaps of components in the end. We probably had a lot that could be consolidated, but there was always something that someone could use to deliver some content, and it really kept our content model, our node entities pretty simple. Like, really anyone could put any content on any page, and the entities were more for the editors to kind of understand their own content model in some cases. So I felt like it was a fairly vanilla Drupal site in that sense, in a weird way. Like it felt like a site that was going to keep ticking. If they decided, someone came along and said, I'd rather do the content model like this, good luck to them. But that'd be really hard to change because to keep all those things working.